I inherited a working lighthouse on the coast of Maine, and the HOA demanded I turn it off permanently within 72 hours of moving in. My name is Robert Jamison, and I never imagined that buying a historic property in the small coastal town of Harborview would lead to one of the most absurd legal battles of my life. The lighthouse had been in continuous operation since 1887, a beacon for ships navigating the treacherous rocky coastline along the Atlantic. When my great-uncle passed away and left me the property, I thought I had won the lottery. A beautiful three-bedroom keeper's house attached to a fully functional lighthouse, complete with ocean views and a piece of maritime history. What I did not know was that 5 years ago, the surrounding area had been developed into an upscale residential community called Seaside Estates, complete with a power-hungry homeowners association. I moved in on a Friday in late April, spending the weekend unpacking boxes and marveling at my good fortune. The lighthouse itself was automated, maintained under a contract with the Coast Guard, and required minimal intervention from me. It had been updated over the years with modern LED technology, but the original Fresnel lens still stood proudly in the lantern room. Every evening at dusk, the light would begin its rotation, sending beams of light across the dark water, just as it had for over a century. On Monday morning, I was enjoying my coffee on the wraparound porch when a silver Mercedes pulled into my gravel driveway. A woman in her late 40s emerged, wearing pressed white capris and a nautical striped shirt that looked like it had never seen actual sea spray. Her blonde hair was cut in what I could only describe as a speak-to-the-manager style, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "Good morning," I called out, raising my mug in greeting. "Can I help you?" She did not return my smile. Instead, she marched up the porch steps with the confidence of someone who believed the entire world was her jurisdiction. "I'm Patricia Donovan, president of the Seaside Estates Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your property immediately." I set down my coffee. "Okay, what seems to be the problem?" Patricia opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Your lighthouse is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. Section 4.2 prohibits exterior lighting that creates a nuisance to neighboring properties. Section 7.8 requires all structures to maintain aesthetic harmony with the community. And Section 12.3 states that no commercial or industrial operations may be conducted within the residential zone." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what I had just heard. "You want me to turn off a federally maintained lighthouse?" "It is a nuisance," she said firmly. "Several residents have complained that the rotating light shines through their windows at night, disrupting their sleep. Mrs. Henderson has had to install blackout curtains in 3 bedrooms. The porters say it interferes with their home theater experience. This is a residential community, Mr. Jamison, not a commercial shipping district." "This lighthouse has been operational since 1887, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice level. "The houses in Seaside Estates were built 5 years ago. The lighthouse was here first, by about 130 years. Patricia's expression hardened. "That is irrelevant. When your great-uncle sold portions of his property for development, he signed an agreement that all structures on the remaining land would comply with HOA regulations. You inherited that obligation along with the property." I felt my jaw clench. My great-uncle sold land, not control over a federal aid to navigation. The lighthouse is not a decorative lawn ornament, it is critical infrastructure for maritime safety. "Then, I suggest you take it up with your attorney," Patricia said, producing another document from her portfolio. "This is your official notice of violation. You have 72 hours to cease the lighting operations, or the association will begin fining you $1,000 per day. Additionally, we reserve the right to place a lien on your property and pursue legal action to force compliance." She thrust the papers into my hands and turned on her heel, her white sneakers crunching against the gravel as she returned to her Mercedes. I stood there on my porch, watching her drive away, the notice of violation fluttering in the ocean breeze. For several minutes, I just stared at the papers in disbelief. Then, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. My first call was to the Coast Guard station in Portland. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached Lieutenant Commander Sarah Stevens, who oversaw aids to navigation for the region. "Let me get this straight," she said after I explained the situation. An HOA is ordering you to deactivate a federally maintained lighthouse? That's exactly what I'm saying, I replied. They're claiming it's a nuisance and threatening me with daily fines if I don't shut it down within 3 days. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Jamison, you do understand that you legally cannot shut down that lighthouse, right? The Harborview Lighthouse is listed as an active aid to navigation on all maritime charts. It is essential for vessel traffic in that area, especially during fog conditions. Deactivating it without proper authorization would violate federal law. That's what I thought, I said, relief flooding through me. But this HOA president seems to think her authority supersedes federal maritime regulations. It absolutely does not, Lieutenant Commander Stevens said firmly. I'm going to document this conversation and pass it up the chain. In the meantime, do not, under any circumstances, turn off that lighthouse. We'll be in touch. My second call was to an attorney named Marcus Holloway, who specialized in property law and had been recommended by a friend. After explaining the situation, he let out a low whistle. This is either going to be a very short case or a very interesting one, Marcus said. HOAs have broad authority over aesthetic and use restrictions, but they cannot override federal law or interfere with governmental operations. The question is whether the association can make a credible argument that the lighthouse falls under their jurisdiction despite its federal status. What should I do about the 72-hour deadline? I asked. Ignore it for now, he advised. Don't turn off the lighthouse and document everything. Save all correspondence from the HOA. If they try to fine you, we'll challenge it. I'll draft a letter explaining why their demands are legally baseless and send it to this Patricia Donovan tomorrow. I spent the rest of the day researching HOA law and federal maritime regulations, trying to understand how I had ended up in this bizarre situation. As evening approached, I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. Right on schedule, the lighthouse beam activated, beginning its steady rotation across the darkening water. Through my binoculars, I could see several fishing vessels making their way back to harbor, using the light to navigate safely. The next morning, I was awakened at 7 by someone pounding on my door. I stumbled downstairs in my pajamas to find Patricia standing on my porch again, this time accompanied by 2 other women who looked equally displeased. Mr. Jamison, the lighthouse was operational again last night, Patricia announced as if I might not have noticed. This is unacceptable. Good morning to you too, I said. And yes, the lighthouse was operational because it's required by federal law to be operational. One of the other women, a thin brunette with too much makeup, stepped forward. I'm Deborah Winchester, HOA treasurer. We've consulted with our attorney, and your great-uncle's property agreement clearly states that all structures must comply with community standards. Your attorney is wrong, I said flatly, and you should probably get a second opinion before you dig yourselves into a deeper hole. I've already spoken with the Coast Guard and my own attorney. The lighthouse is a federal aid to navigation. You have no authority over it whatsoever. The third woman, who had red hair and wore workout clothes despite the early hour, crossed her arms. This is a residential community. We have property rights. Your lighthouse is diminishing our home values and quality of life. Who are you? I asked. Margaret Fuller, HOA secretary, and I live 3 houses down from here. That light sweeps across my master bedroom every 12 seconds all night long. It's like living next to a prison watchtower. Then I suggest blackout curtains, I replied. The lighthouse was here first. You chose to buy a house near an active lighthouse. That's a you problem, not a me problem. Patricia's face flushed red. We are not going to argue with you on your doorstep. The fine schedule begins tomorrow, $1,000 per day until the light is permanently extinguished. Good day. They retreated to a white Lexus SUV, and I watched them drive away before calling Marcus Holloway again. They just showed up at my house with threats, I told him. 3 of them, like some kind of HOA hit squad. Marcus sighed. I was afraid of this. HOAs can be incredibly aggressive when they think their authority is being challenged. I'm expediting that letter. It'll be overnighted to Patricia Donovan today with copies to the other board members. In the meantime, I'm also going to reach out to the Coast Guard's legal office and see if they want to intervene directly. What if they start actually fining me? I asked. Let them try. We'll challenge every penny in court, and when we win, they'll be liable for your legal fees. But Robert, I need to be honest with you. Even if we're right on the law, and we are, this could drag on for months. HOAs have deep pockets from community dues, and they can be vindictive. Are you prepared for this fight? I looked out my window at the lighthouse standing tall against the blue sky, its white tower a monument to over a century of service. I didn't ask for this fight, but yeah, I'm prepared. This lighthouse has saved lives. I'm not going to let some power-hungry HOA president shut it down because it inconveniences her neighbors. Good, Marcus said. That's the attitude we need. I'll be in touch soon. The 72-hour deadline came and went. On Thursday morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox from the Seaside Estates HOA. Inside was a formal notice stating that I was now accruing fines of $1,000 per day, with the current balance of $3,000 due immediately. They also warned that if the violations continued for 30 days, they would place a lien on my property. I photographed the letter and sent it to Marcus, then filed it away in a folder I had labeled HOA Nonsense. That evening, I decided to be proactive. I drove into town and stopped by the Harborview Maritime Museum, a small but well-maintained building near the harbor. The director, an elderly man named Captain Eugene Morrison, had known my great-uncle for decades. "Robert," he greeted me warmly when I walked in. "I heard you had taken over the lighthouse. How are you settling in?" "Honestly, Captain, I'm dealing with some unexpected complications," I said, and proceeded to explain the HOA situation. Captain Morrison's jovial expression darkened as I spoke. When I finished, he shook his head slowly. "This is outrageous. That lighthouse is a historic landmark. It's saved countless lives over the years. I've got documentation of at least 15 major incidents where vessels would have run aground or collided with the rocks if not for that beacon." "Do you think that would help my case?" I asked. "Absolutely," he said. "But more than that, I think we need to make this a public issue. The Harborview community has a deep connection to its maritime heritage. If people knew that the HOA was trying to shut down the lighthouse, there would be hell to pay." He walked over to a filing cabinet and began pulling out folders. "Let me give you copies of the historical documentation, and I'm going to make some calls. There's a state maritime preservation board that might have jurisdiction here. Also, the local news might be interested in this story." "I don't want to turn this into a circus," I said hesitantly. "Sometimes a little public pressure is exactly what's needed," Captain Morrison replied. "Trust me, Patricia Donovan and her crew care deeply about their public image. Bad publicity might make them reconsider their approach." I left the museum with a thick folder of historical documents and a renewed sense of purpose. When I got home, I spread everything out on my dining room table and started reading. The lighthouse had indeed been instrumental in numerous rescues over the decades. There were newspaper clippings from the 1920s about a schooner that had navigated to safety through a blizzard using the light. A letter from 1954 from a fishing fleet thanking the lighthouse keeper for preventing what could have been a deadly collision. Coast Guard commendations, even a photo of my great-uncle receiving an award for his years of faithful service maintaining the beacon. As I was reading, my phone rang. It was Lieutenant Commander Stevens from the Coast Guard. "Mr. Jamison, I wanted to update you on the situation," she said. "We've escalated this to our legal department, and they're preparing a formal statement. The short version is that the Coast Guard maintains operational authority over all active aids to navigation, and no local entity, including an HOA, can order one deactivated. We'll be sending a letter to the HOA making our position clear." "That's great news," I said. "There's more," she continued. "We're also going to conduct an inspection of the lighthouse next week to verify its operational status and document its importance to maritime safety in the region. If the HOA continues to interfere with its operation, we can pursue federal charges for obstruction of navigational aids." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. "Thank you, Commander. I really appreciate the Coast Guard backing me up on this." "The Coast Guard doesn't take kindly to anyone compromising maritime safety," she replied. "We'll see this through." Over the weekend, I tried to relax and enjoy my new home, but the tension was building. I kept expecting Patricia or her HOA cronies to show up with more threats. Instead, on Saturday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 60s wearing a blazer and jeans knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, and he lived in one of the houses in Seaside Estates. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by uninvited," he said. "I heard about the situation with the HOA and the Lighthouse. I wanted you to know that not all of us support what Patricia is doing." I invited him in and made coffee. Thomas explained that he had been a merchant marine for 30 years before retiring to Harborview. "That lighthouse represents everything important about maritime tradition and safety," he said, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. "Patricia and her friends, they don't understand that. They see it as an inconvenience, something that interferes with their perfect little suburban fantasy. But this is a coastal town. The ocean is in our blood. We can't just pretend the lighthouse is a lawn decoration that can be switched off when it becomes bothersome." "Have you said anything to the HOA board?" I asked. Thomas nodded. "I've tried. I spoke at the last meeting and argued that the lighthouse is part of the community's heritage. But Patricia shut me down. She said that property values and resident comfort take precedence over nostalgia." That's what she called it, nostalgia. He shook his head in disgust. "I've lived here for 3 years, and I specifically bought my house because of the lighthouse. I love seeing that beam at night. It reminds me of my years at sea. There are others who feel the same way, but Patricia has a tight grip on the board, and most people are too intimidated to challenge her." "What about voting her out?" I suggested. "Guillaume, elections aren't until next year," Thomas said. "And honestly, most residents are apathetic. They pay their dues and don't think much about HOA politics until something directly affects them. Patricia has cultivated a small group of supporters who show up to every meeting and vote as a block. The rest of us get outvoted every time." We talked for over an hour, and by the time Thomas left, I felt less alone in this fight. He promised to rally support among other residents and to attend any future HOA meetings where the lighthouse was discussed. On Monday, the news broke. The local paper, the Harborview Gazette, ran a front-page story titled, "Historic Lighthouse Under Threat from HOA." Captain Morrison had indeed made those calls, and a reporter named Jessica Chen had done her homework. The article detailed the lighthouse's history, its importance to maritime safety, and the HOA's attempts to shut it down. It included quotes from Captain Morrison, from me, and even from a Coast Guard spokesperson confirming the lighthouse's active status as a federal aid to navigation. The article also included a comment from Patricia Donovan, who stated that the HOA was simply enforcing community standards and protecting property values, and that historic significance does not exempt anyone from reasonable regulations. My phone started ringing almost immediately. I received calls from 2 more local residents who supported the lighthouse, from a reporter at a Portland television station who wanted to do a follow-up story, and from Marcus Holloway. "This is perfect," Marcus said. "Public opinion is going to be strongly in your favor. Maritime communities don't take kindly to people messing with lighthouses. Keep giving interviews, but be careful what you say. Stay factual, stay calm, and emphasize the safety aspect." That evening, the Portland TV station sent a crew to my property. They filmed the lighthouse, interviewed me on the porch, and got some beautiful sunset footage of the beacon activating. The segment aired on the evening news, and suddenly, my little dispute with the HOA was regional news. The publicity seemed to enrage Patricia. On Tuesday morning, I received another certified letter, this one even more threatening than the last. The HOA was now claiming that I was operating an attractive nuisance and that the lighthouse posed safety hazards to neighborhood children who might try to climb it. They were also threatening to sue me personally for willful disregard of community regulations and seeking an injunction to force the lighthouse's deactivation. Marcus read the letter and actually laughed. "They're panicking," he said. "These arguments are desperate and legally baseless. An attractive nuisance claim requires that the property owner create or maintain a dangerous condition. A federally maintained lighthouse with proper fencing and restricted access doesn't qualify. And the injunction will never be granted because they can't override federal authority." "So what do?" I asked. "We respond formally, and we wait for them to make the next move. In the meantime, the Coast Guard inspection is scheduled for Thursday. Make sure everything is accessible and well documented." Thursday arrived, and so did a Coast Guard team. Lieutenant Commander Stevens brought 2 technicians and a legal officer. They spent 3 hours inspecting every aspect of the lighthouse, from the LED systems to the backup generators to the structural integrity of the tower itself. They took measurements, photographs, and interviewed me about the maintenance schedule. When they finished, Lieutenant Commander Stevens stood in my living room with her team and delivered her assessment. "The lighthouse is in excellent condition and performing exactly as required," she said. "It's a critical aid to navigation for this section of coast. We've documented 15 vessels that transit this area daily on average, plus recreational boat traffic during summer months. Weather conditions here can deteriorate rapidly, and the lighthouse provides essential guidance, especially during fog and storms." The legal officer, a lieutenant named David Porter, added, "We've prepared a comprehensive report that will be submitted to the Maritime Administration. Additionally, we're issuing a formal notice to the HOA board. Any attempt to interfere with the operation of this lighthouse will be treated as a violation of federal law, specifically Title 14, United States Code, Section 81, which makes it illegal to damage or interfere with aids to navigation. Violations can result in fines up to $10,000 and criminal prosecution." I felt a surge of relief. "So they can't legally force me to turn it off?" "They cannot," Lieutenant Commander Stevens confirmed. "And if they try, they'll be dealing with federal law enforcement, not just a property dispute. We're taking this very seriously, Mr. Jamison." After the Coast Guard team left, I called Marcus and updated him. He was ecstatic. "This changes everything," he said. "The Coast Guard's involvement gives us federal backing. I'm going to send a copy of their report to the HOA's attorney. At this point, if Patricia continues to push this issue, she's exposing the entire association to serious legal liability." But Patricia was not the type to back down easily. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and the lighthouse dispute was on the agenda. Marcus advised me to attend, so that evening I drove to the Seaside Estates Community Center, a modern building with conference rooms and a small auditorium. The meeting room was packed. Apparently, word had spread, and residents had shown up in numbers I hadn't expected. I recognized Thomas Brennan sitting near the front. There were also several people I had seen interviewed on the news who supported the lighthouse, but there was a contingent of residents who looked distinctly unfriendly, clustered around Patricia and her board members. Patricia called the meeting to order and plowed through several routine agenda items before finally addressing the lighthouse issue. "As many of you are aware, we have an ongoing dispute with Robert Jamison regarding the lighthouse on his property," she began, her tone clipped and professional. "The board has determined that the lighthouse operation violates multiple community standards. Despite our repeated attempts to resolve this matter, Mr. Jamison has refused to comply with HOA regulations." I raised my hand, and Patricia reluctantly acknowledged me. "I'd like to address the board and the community," I said, standing up. "First, I'm not refusing to comply out of stubbornness. Federal law requires that the lighthouse remain operational. The Coast Guard has confirmed this in writing and has stated that any attempt to shut down the lighthouse would violate federal statutes. I legally cannot turn it off, even if I wanted to." A murmur ran through the crowd. Patricia's face tightened. "Fortina." "Furthermore," I continued, "the lighthouse has been in continuous operation since 1887. It's a historic landmark and a critical aid to maritime navigation. The Coast Guard conducted a full inspection last week and documented its importance to vessel safety in this area. This isn't about being difficult or ignoring community standards. This is about maritime safety and federal law." Thomas stood up next. "I'd like to speak in support of Mr. Jamison. The lighthouse is part of this community's heritage. Many of us moved here because of the maritime character of Harborview. Trying to shut down a historic lighthouse because a few people find it mildly inconvenient is short-sighted and frankly embarrassing." Several people applauded, but Patricia banged her gavel. "This is not a debate," she snapped. "The board has made its decision. The lighthouse violates HOA regulations, and we will pursue all available legal remedies to enforce compliance." A woman near the back raised her hand. "What legal remedies? The Coast Guard says it's illegal to turn off the lighthouse. Are you planning to sue the federal government?" Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Patricia's face flushed red. "The board will consult with our attorneys and determine the appropriate course of action," she said stiffly. "With respect, Madam President," said a man I didn't recognize, "you're going to waste a lot of our HOA dues fighting a battle you can't win. The Coast Guard has jurisdiction here, not us. Maybe it's time to drop this and focus on actual community issues." More applause. Patricia looked furious, but before she could respond, Margaret Fuller, the HOA secretary, leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Patricia's expression shifted from anger to calculation. "Very well," Patricia said coldly. "We'll table this discussion pending further legal review. But I want it on record that this board takes community standards seriously, and we will not be intimidated by federal overreach or outside pressure." The meeting moved on to other topics, but the tension in the room was palpable. Afterward, several residents approached me to offer their support. Thomas clapped me on the shoulder. "You handled that well," he said. "Patricia's losing support. That speech about federal overreach was desperate. People can see she's fighting a losing battle." I wanted to believe him, but I could see Patricia across the room, huddled with Deborah and Margaret, their expressions dark and determined. This wasn't over. Over the next 2 weeks, an uneasy stalemate settled in. The HOA stopped sending me threatening letters, but I could feel them regrouping. Marcus received a letter from the HOA's attorney requesting a meeting to discuss potential compromises. We agreed to meet the following week. In the meantime, I started receiving support from unexpected quarters. A Maritime Preservation Society in Portland reached out and offered to help with legal costs if needed. The Harborview Town Council passed a resolution recognizing the lighthouse as a historic landmark. Even the state senator from our district issued a statement supporting the lighthouse's continued operation. The meeting with the HOA's attorney took place on a Wednesday afternoon at Marcus's office in Portland. Patricia, Deborah, and Margaret attended, along with their lawyer, a stern-looking man named Gerald Whitmore. Marcus and I sat across the conference table from them. Gerald opened the discussion. "We're here to find a reasonable compromise," he began. "The HOA recognizes that the lighthouse has historic and maritime significance. However, our clients represent residents who are genuinely impacted by the light's operation. We're proposing a middle ground." "What kind of middle ground?" Marcus asked skeptically. Gerald slid a document across the table. "The HOA is willing to drop all fines and violations if Mr. Jamison agrees to implement light-blocking measures on the seaward side of the beacon, reducing its visibility to residential areas while maintaining its functionality for maritime purposes." I scanned the document quickly. They were proposing modifications that would essentially require restructuring the lighthouse's light pattern. "This won't work," I said flatly. "The lighthouse uses a Fresnel lens that creates a specific light pattern designed for 360-degree visibility. What you're proposing would require alterations to federal equipment and would compromise the lighthouse's effectiveness. The Coast Guard would never approve this." Patricia leaned forward. "Then what about operational hours? Could the lighthouse be turned off between midnight and 5 a.m. when boat traffic is minimal?" "No," I said. "Maritime traffic operates 24 hours a day, and emergencies don't happen on a convenient schedule. The whole point of a lighthouse is that it's always there when needed." "What about installing taller fencing or landscaping to block the light at ground level?" Deborah suggested. Marcus shook his head. "That won't address your clients' complaints about the light entering their upper floor windows. And again, any modifications have to be approved by the Coast Guard, which has already stated that the lighthouse is operating exactly as it should." The meeting went in circles for another hour, with the HOA representatives proposing various compromises that all involved reducing the lighthouse's effectiveness, and Marcus and I rejecting each one. Finally, Gerald Whitmore closed his briefcase. "It appears we're at an impasse," he said. "If no accommodation can be reached, my clients will have no choice but to pursue litigation." "Litigation over what?" Marcus responded. "You have no legal standing to modify or shut down a federal aid to navigation. You'll lose, and your clients will be liable for our legal fees." Patricia stood up abruptly. "We'll see about that. This community has rights, and we won't be bullied by federal bureaucracy or by someone who thinks owning a historic property gives him license to ignore his neighbors." They left in a huff, and I turned to Marcus. "Where do we go from here?" "We wait," he said. "They're going to consult with other attorneys, realize they don't have a case, and hopefully drop this. But Patricia strikes me as someone who has a hard time admitting defeat. Stay alert." He was right to warn me. 2 days later, I came home to find that someone had filed a complaint with the town's code enforcement office, claiming that my property had multiple safety violations. The next morning, a very apologetic code enforcement officer named Phil Rodriguez showed up to conduct an inspection. "I'm sorry about this," Phil said as we walked around the property. "The complaint was anonymous, but we have to follow up. They're claiming unsafe electrical wiring, structural issues with the Lighthouse Tower, and improper fencing." I showed him the recent Coast Guard inspection report, the electrical certifications, and the structural engineering assessment that had been done when I inherited the property. Everything was up to code and properly maintained. Phil checked off items on his clipboard. "Yeah, everything looks fine. This complaint was clearly bogus. Someone's just trying to harass you." "Can you tell me who filed it?" I asked, though I already knew. "It was anonymous, but it came through the HOA office," Phil admitted. "Look, off the record, everyone in town knows what Patricia's trying to do. Most of us think it's ridiculous. The Lighthouse is an icon. Don't let them get to you." The harassment continued in petty ways over the following weeks. Someone filed a noise complaint claiming the Lighthouse fog signal was too loud, even though the fog signal was only activated by the Coast Guard during specific weather conditions and was entirely within federal regulations. Anonymous complaints were filed about my trash bins being visible from the street, about my grass being too long, about my vehicle being improperly parked in my own driveway. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but it was exhausting. Marcus said it was a common tactic used by aggressive HOAs to wear down opponents. "They're hoping you'll get frustrated and leave, or at least compromise just to make it stop," he explained. "Don't give them the satisfaction. Document everything and stay the course." Then, in early June, everything escalated dramatically. I was working in my home office when I heard vehicles pulling up outside. Looking out the window, I saw a truck from an electrical contractor company, followed by Patricia's Mercedes. I rushed outside to find Patricia and 2 men in work uniforms standing near the base of the lighthouse. "What the hell's going on?" I demanded. Patricia held up a document. "We've obtained a work order to inspect and potentially modify the electrical systems of the lighthouse. As the HOA has jurisdiction over community infrastructure, we have the right to ensure all systems meet our standards." One of the workers looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we were hired to do an electrical inspection. The work order says it's been authorized by the property owner." "I'm the property owner, and I authorize nothing," I said firmly. "This is trespassing, and if you touch anything related to the lighthouse, you'll be interfering with federal property." The worker immediately backed away. "We're not getting involved in this. Come on, Frank, let's go." The 2 contractors got back in their truck and drove away, leaving Patricia standing there with her fraudulent work order. "You forged a work authorization?" I said incredulously. "That's a crime, Patricia." "I did no such thing," she said coldly. "The work order was prepared by the HOA based on our authority under the community covenant." "You have no authority over federal property," I shot back. "And attempting to access or modify the lighthouse without authorization is a federal offense. The Coast Guard was very clear about that." Patricia's expression was venomous. "You think you're so smart hiding behind federal regulations, but this community is tired of your defiance. You're making enemies, Mr. Jamison. Life can be very difficult for someone who refuses to cooperate with their neighbors." "Is that a threat?" I asked, pulling out my phone and starting a voice recording. She noticed the phone and her expression shifted. "Of course not. I'm simply observing that community harmony requires compromise, something you seem incapable of." She got back in her Mercedes and drove away. I immediately called Marcus and reported what had happened. "That's attempted fraud and possibly attempted vandalism of federal property," Marcus said. "Do you still have the fake work order?" "No, she took it with her." "Damn. But you have your phone recording?" "Yes, I got her implicit threat recorded." "Good. I'm contacting the Coast Guard's legal office and the U.S. Attorney's office. This has gone beyond a civil dispute. Patricia just crossed into criminal territory. Later that day, I also filed a police report with the Harbor View Police Department. The officer who took my statement, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, shook his head as he wrote, "Patricia Donovan is a piece of work," he said. "We've had other complaints about HOA harassment, but this is a new level. I'll forward this to the detective division, and they'll follow up." Things moved quickly after that. The Coast Guard sent a formal letter to the HOA board and to Patricia personally, warning that any further attempts to access or modify the lighthouse would result in federal charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office opened an investigation into the attempted fraud. Marcus filed a restraining order against Patricia, prohibiting her from coming onto my property or having any direct contact with me. The court granted a temporary order pending a full hearing. But the real turning point came from an unexpected direction. The Maritime Administration, a federal agency within the Department of Transportation, got involved. They sent a representative to Harborview to assess the situation, and after a thorough review, they made a dramatic decision. I received a call from Marcus on a Friday afternoon in late June. His voice was excited. "Robert, you need to sit down for this. The Maritime Administration is invoking federal preemption. They're issuing a formal ruling that completely strips the HOA of any authority over the lighthouse or its operation. Not only that, but they're designating the lighthouse and its surrounding property as a maritime heritage site, which gives it federal protection status." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked, my heart racing. "It means the HOA is done. They have zero jurisdiction. Any future attempts to interfere with the lighthouse will be treated as interference with federal property. They can't fine you, they can't restrict you, they can't do anything. You've won, completely and totally." I sat down heavily in my chair, overwhelmed with relief. "When does this take effect?" "The ruling is effective immediately. I'm receiving the official documentation now, and I'll forward copies to you, the HOA board, and their attorney. This is over, Robert." The following week, the Maritime Administration held a public hearing in Harborview to present their findings and ruling. The town hall was packed with residents, media, and representatives from various maritime organizations. A senior official, named Director Andrew Mitchell, presented the administration's conclusions. After extensive review, the Maritime Administration has determined that the Harborview Lighthouse is a critical aid to navigation and a significant maritime heritage site, he stated. Its operation is essential for vessel safety along this section of the Maine coast. Federal law provides clear preemption over state and local regulations when it comes to navigational aids. No homeowners association, municipality, or other local entity may restrict, modify, or prohibit the operation of this lighthouse, he continued. Furthermore, we are designating the lighthouse and its property as a protected maritime heritage site under federal law. This designation ensures its preservation and continued operation for future generations. Director Mitchell then addressed the HOA directly. The Seaside Estates Homeowners Association's attempts to shut down or modify the lighthouse were legally baseless from the beginning. Had they consulted with maritime law experts, this situation could have been avoided. Instead, their actions wasted time and resources and potentially compromised maritime safety. We strongly caution any other organizations against similar actions. Patricia, who was sitting in the audience with her attorneys, looked like she had been struck. Deborah and Margaret sat on either side of her, their faces pale. But the Maritime Administration wasn't finished. Director Mitchell announced that they were also referring the matter to federal prosecutors for potential charges related to Patricia's attempted unauthorized access to the lighthouse. Attempted interference with aids to navigation is a serious offense, he said. While we typically focus on education and compliance, the egregious nature of this case warrants additional scrutiny. After the hearing, reporters swarmed the HOA board members. Patricia tried to maintain her composure, giving a brief statement about how the HOA had been acting in the best interests of the community and had respected legal processes. But the damage was done. The story went regional and then national, with headlines like HOA overruled by feds in lighthouse battle and Maritime Board shuts down HOA's attempt to darken historic beacon. The backlash within Seaside Estates was swift. Thomas Brennan organized a petition calling for the removal of the entire HOA board, and within 2 weeks, they had signatures from over 60% of the community residents. An emergency special election was scheduled for August. In the meantime, the legal consequences for Patricia personally began to mount. The U.S. Attorney's Office decided to prosecute her for attempted interference with federal property based on the fake work order incident. While the charges were misdemeanors rather than felonies, they carried the possibility of fines and probation. Patricia's attorney negotiated a plea deal. She would plead guilty to 1 count of attempted unauthorized access to federal property, pay a fine of $5,000, and perform 100 hours of community service. She would also be required to resign from the HOA board and was prohibited from holding any HOA leadership position for 5 years. Deborah and Margaret, who had been less directly involved in the attempted contractor incident, faced no criminal charges but resigned from the board under pressure from the community. The special election in August brought in a completely new HOA board led by Thomas Brennan as president. One of their first actions was to formally apologize to me and to rescind all fines and violations that had been issued. They also passed a resolution recognizing the lighthouse as a community asset and pledging to support its preservation. Thomas stopped by my house the day after the election, bringing a bottle of champagne. "I think we should celebrate," he said with a grin. "You stood up to Patricia's tyranny and won. The whole community owes you a debt of gratitude." We sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the ocean, and toasted to the lighthouse. "I never wanted to be some kind of community hero," I said. "I just wanted to live in my lighthouse and not have someone tell me to turn it off." "Sometimes standing up for what's right makes you a hero whether you want to be one or not," Thomas replied. "And you did more than save your lighthouse. You broke Patricia's stranglehold on this community. People were afraid to challenge her. You showed them it could be done." As summer turned to fall, life settled into a peaceful routine. The lighthouse continued its nightly rotation, guiding vessels safely along the coast. I gave tours to school groups and historical societies, sharing the lighthouse's story and its importance to maritime safety. The property became a point of pride for Harborview rather than a source of conflict. In September, the Coast Guard held an official ceremony at the lighthouse to celebrate its designation as a federal maritime heritage site. Lieutenant Commander Stevens presented me with a plaque recognizing my role in preserving this piece of American maritime history. "The Harborview Lighthouse has served mariners faithfully for over a century," she said in her speech. "Thanks to Robert Jamison's determination and the support of this community, it will continue to serve for generations to come. This lighthouse stands as a reminder that some things are bigger than property disputes or personal convenience. Maritime safety is a public good, and protecting our navigational infrastructure protects lives." I also received a letter from the American Lighthouse Foundation, congratulating me on the successful defense of the lighthouse and offering their support for any future preservation efforts. They included a historical designation certificate and information about grants available for lighthouse maintenance. As for Patricia, I saw her once more, in October. I was in town at the grocery store when we ended up in the same checkout line. She looked older, diminished somehow. The confident, aggressive woman who had appeared on my porch demanding I shut down the lighthouse was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and bitter. She noticed me and quickly looked away, focusing intently on her groceries. I considered saying something, but what was there to say? She had brought all of this on herself through arrogance and overreach. Instead, I simply finished my transaction and left. Later, I heard through the Harborview grapevine that Patricia and her husband were selling their house in Seaside Estates and moving to Florida. Apparently, she had become a pariah in the community, and the legal bills from her failed lighthouse crusade had been substantial. Her departure was met with little sympathy and considerable relief. Winter came to the Maine coast, bringing storms and fog and the kind of weather that reminded everyone why lighthouses exist. During one particularly brutal nor'easter in December, a fishing vessel got caught in the storm and lost its navigation equipment. The captain later told the Coast Guard that the Harborview lighthouse beam was the only thing that guided them safely back to harbor through the blinding snow and wind. When I heard that story, I thought about Patricia's complaints about the light shining through bedroom windows. I thought about her insistence that property values and personal comfort mattered more than maritime tradition. And I was grateful that I had fought back, that the Coast Guard and the Maritime Administration had supported me, and that the lighthouse continued to serve its essential purpose. One evening in late December, Thomas stopped by with several other new HOA board members. They presented me with a gift, a beautifully framed historical photograph of the Harborview Lighthouse from 1910, showing the lighthouse keeper and his family standing proudly at its base. "We wanted you to have this," Thomas said. "It's from the Maritime Museum's collection. Captain Morrison thought you should be the one to keep it. You're part of the lighthouse's history now, just like the keepers who came before you." I hung the photograph in the lighthouse keeper's house in the main hallway where I would see it every day. Looking at those faces from over a century ago, I felt a connection to them, to everyone who had maintained this beacon through wars and depressions and storms and changing times. The lighthouse had survived all of it, and now it had survived the HOA too. On New Year's Eve, I climbed to the lantern room as midnight approached. The night was crystal clear, cold and brilliant with stars. The lighthouse beam rotated steadily, its light reaching out across the dark water. In the distance, I could see the lights of several vessels making their way along the coast. As the year changed over, I made a silent promise to my great-uncle, to the lighthouse keepers of the past, and to the mariners who depended on this beacon. I would maintain the lighthouse faithfully. I would protect it from those who didn't understand its importance, and I would make sure it continued to shine for another century and beyond. The fight with the HOA had been absurd, frustrating, and at times infuriating, but it had also been necessary, because some things are worth fighting for, some traditions matter, and some lights must never be allowed to go dark, no matter how inconvenient they might be to someone's suburban fantasy. The Harborview Lighthouse had stood for 137 years, through storms and wars and changing times. It had guided countless vessels to safety, saved untold lives, and become a symbol of this coastal community's maritime heritage. One small-minded HOA president and her cronies had tried to extinguish it for the sake of convenience and control. They had failed, completely and utterly. The lighthouse stood, the beam rotated, and mariners continued to navigate safely through these waters. And I stood in the lantern room, watching the light sweep across the dark Atlantic, knowing that I had played a small part in ensuring that this beacon would continue to shine. Below, in seaside estates, lights glowed in the houses. Some of those lights belonged to people who had supported me, who understood the importance of preserving maritime heritage. Others belonged to people who had sided with Patricia, who saw the lighthouse as nothing more than a nuisance. And some belonged to people who had never cared one way or another, who had watched the drama unfold with detached curiosity. But they all lived in the shadow of the lighthouse now, whether they liked it or not. And on foggy nights and during storms, when the beacon swept through the darkness and the fog signal called out its warning, I like to think that even the former complainers felt a small measure of security, knowing that the light was there. The new year stretched ahead, full of possibility. I had plans for the lighthouse property, a small museum in the keeper's house perhaps, or educational programs for local students about maritime history and navigation. The Maritime Administration had expressed interest in supporting such initiatives, and Captain Morrison at the Maritime Museum was eager to collaborate. But for now, on this New Year's Eve, I was content to simply be here, in this lighthouse, watching the beam rotate and the stars wheel overhead. The battle was over. The lighthouse was safe. And somewhere, out on the dark water, mariners were navigating home, guided by the light that had almost been extinguished by bureaucratic pettiness and suburban arrogance. I descended the spiral staircase and walked back to the keeper's house, where I had left a fire burning in the fireplace. My home was warm and welcoming, filled with the history of all those who had lived here before me. I poured myself a drink and sat down in my favorite chair, the one that faced the window with a view of the tower. The lighthouse stood tall and bright against the night sky, exactly as it should be, and I knew with absolute certainty that it would still be standing long after I was gone, still guiding mariners, still serving its purpose, still shining its light into the darkness. Patricia Donovan had tried to order my lighthouse dark. The Maritime Board had overruled her entire board, and the light still shines. That's the story of how I inherited a lighthouse and accidentally went to war with an HOA. It's the story of federal preemption, maritime law, and the importance of standing up for what matters. It's the story of a community that learned to value its heritage over the petty tyranny of a power-hungry homeowners association president. But most of all, it's the story of a lighthouse that refused to go dark, and the people who made sure it never would. As I sat there in my chair, watching the beam rotate through the night, I thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with this lighthouse over the past year. Lieutenant Commander Stevens and her Coast Guard team, who had backed me up when I needed it most. Marcus Holloway, who had provided expert legal guidance through the entire ordeal. Captain Morrison, who had rallied public support and provided historical documentation. Thomas Brennan and the other residents who had stood up to Patricia's bullying. Even Jessica Chen, the reporter whose articles had brought attention to the issue and helped shift public opinion. Everyone had played a role, everyone had contributed something, and together we had preserved something important. I finished my drink and headed to bed, tired but content. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new adventures in lighthouse keeping. But tonight, I could rest easy, knowing that the beacon was secured, the heritage was protected, and the light would continue to guide mariners safely home. In the darkness, the lighthouse beam swept across my bedroom window, just as it had done for over a century, just as it would continue to do for centuries to come. The rhythmic flash was comforting, a heartbeat of light in the coastal night. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, lulled by the distant sound of waves and the knowledge that some battles, the ones that truly matter, are worth fighting no matter how absurd they might seem. The Harborview Lighthouse had survived storms, wars, and changing technology. It had now survived the Seaside Estates HOA, and that light, that beautiful, essential, historic light, would never be ordered dark again.